I'm Executive Director of the LifeSend Institute Missoula Demonstration Project. The LifeSend Institute was started in 1996 with the mission of improving the quality of life of people who are dying in their families. And the way that we address these issues is through conducting research both locally and in helping communities across the country conduct research. And then we also put together community task forces to work on a variety of different issues, primarily pertaining to family caregiving, dying, death, and bereavement. Recently, with the events in Florida, certainly came to light that there are a lot of varying opinions about very critical end-of-life issues. And so, together with our co-sponsors, we decided to have a panel discussion and a public airing of some of these ideas in hope of really two things. One, that we could learn from one another, and secondly, that we could begin to realize that because we have such varied opinions among us, it's critical that we talk with one another, air our feelings and our values, and come to understand these issues in such a way that we can improve the quality of dying for those whom we love and also for ourselves. So, without further talk, I want to introduce our panelists. Dr. Mark Hansen is the interim director at the Practical Ethics Center. Mark, do you want to wave? My former boss. Also adjunct professor at the university's philosophy department. He holds a doctorate in ethics and religious studies from the University of Virginia, and he's a graduate of St. Olaf College and Yale Divinity School. He was the former executive director of the LifeSend Institute, and there are three of us here tonight now that I think of it. And prior to moving to Montana, he was the associate for ethics and society at the Hastings Center in New York. Pat Williams, at the end of the table, who I think you all know, is an educator who has taught elementary students through graduate students. He's Montana's former congressman, of course, having served 9 terms, in the United States House of Representatives. He came back to us from Washington, D.C. in 1996, and he's now teaching here at the university and as a senior fellow at the O'Connor Center for the Rocky Mountain West. Kit Jackson is a certified hospice and palliative care nurse and owner of Hospice of Missoula and Hospice of Utah. She is a Montana native and a graduate of Carroll College. Greg Shanks is a hospice chaplain working with both Hospice of Missoula and Aspen Hospice, which is in the Bitterroot. Greg has more than 17 years experience providing spiritual support and with organizational and team settings, as well as individual pastoral counseling. Dr. Beth Ammons is board-certified physician in family practice and holistic medicine. She's a native of Missoula and currently works part-time in urgent care, hospice, and office settings. And she just recently joined the nonprofit organization Living Art, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. She's working on fundraising, grant writing, and establishing a website for Living Art, which is a therapeutic-based art and nature program for cancer survivors, the brain injured, and those with chronic illnesses. Finally, Dr. Barbara Spring, another former executive director at LifeSend Institute, is a gerontologist, PhD, and she also has a master's degree in early childhood education. She is the co-founder of Missoula Demonstration Project, which is now the LifeSend Institute, and she's currently our director of research and programs. She's actively involved in developing research and programs for our project, not only in Missoula, but across the United States. She has a real specialty in dealing with family caregiving issues, as well as doing a lot of work finding healing through life stories, understanding grief, and understanding also how to use the arts to stimulate conversations about end-of-life issues among all of us. So, I have two books to get us started tonight. This is, I'm just going to give you a very quick reading from A Good Death, which was written by Charles Meyer. Chuck was a hospital chaplain and administrator for 20 years, and this book, along with the one I'll read from at the end, Good Deaf, Challenges and Choices and Care Options is a really excellent primer on end-of-life issues. And this is what he wrote. He first talks about some of the technology that was originally developed to bridge people who were critically ill back to being a whole person. For example, ventilators or feeding tubes. A lot of this technology came about to get people from one point to the next, people who could heal. And he says, but as our love affair with technology deepened, we began to believe we were required to use these technologies in every circumstance. If we could stave off death temporarily while the body was recovering from disease or surgery, maybe we could do it permanently. We then crossed the line from employing technology as a temporary crutch and increasingly began to use it to prolong bodily functions as long as possible, regardless of the organ systems collapsing around the one that was now taken over by a machine. Maybe that's how some of you perceive what has been going on with end-of-life care. Maybe it's not, but this is just one person's writing about it. So with that, I'd like to open up this discussion to our panelists. And I guess I'd like to start with you, Dr. Ammons, first, to talk about end-of-life issues as they pertain to 2005 and to all of us, and what your concerns are, and perhaps your ideas about what those of us who are here should be concerned with. Thank you.
I'm actually going to start much more simply than that, because I'm not going to assume that everyone here knows about the anatomy and function of the brain. So I brought with me a little poster I made for the first grade class at Paxton last year. Because I think you should not assume things about a group, any group that you speak with, okay? Our brain is incredibly complex, but it has many different functions. In the base of the brain, back here, and into the very top of the spinal column here, we have what's called the midbrain, the reptilian brain, the brain stem. And this part of the brain is used primarily for what we call autonomic function, which means we breathe and don't think about it. We breathe when we're asleep. Our heart continues to pump. We have reflexes that continue to work. Babies are born and they know how to root to nurse. There are some things that are just hardwired, and if we don't have them hardwired, we don't work very well. In terms of the higher function of a human brain, we have the cortex. And this is kind of artificially made up of various lobes. We call it frontal lobe for the front, here, temporal lobe for the temple, parietal lobe, a little farther back, occipital lobe, cerebellum, and then, of course, the brainstem I've already talked about. We've sort of artificially described these because the brain really is consistent of very soft tissue that is folded in many folds. In fact, what I showed the first graders is a bit of tissue paper that was about this big, all crumpled up into a little plastic Easter egg. And I opened it up and said, how big do you think this is? And of course, they didn't know that it was going to be that big. And that's how the brain manages to have so many functions in the cortex, or the outer part of the brain, the higher level of the brain, is that it has these folds. So we have studied the brain, and we know that these different areas of the brain that we've artificially separated into these lobes have many different functions. So we go from the autonomic then to the upper level of the cortex, and we have reasoning. We have certain behaviors that are learned. We have our personality. We can have input, sensory input, smells, sight, hearing, touch, taste, and then we can learn what those mean. We have intelligence. I'm not sure how to define all of that. We can read, we can reason, we can learn to be coordinated, and some of us are coordinated enough to go to the Olympics, and some are not. We can swallow intentionally. We can take food, we can chew it, we can swallow, and we don't choke. Art, music, all of these things are higher levels of functioning. The second part of what I'm going to talk about here, then, is just some simple definitions. I found myself, even when I was trying to prepare for this discussion, a little confused, especially just looking at the news programs when they discussed about vegetative state, comas, brain death. What are these actually mean? So I thought what I'd do is I'd simply describe to you our current definitions of coma, persistent vegetative state, and brain death. A coma can happen very acutely. It can be from an accident, from concussive injury to the brain. It can happen slowly in a metabolic sense when someone has kidney failure or liver failure. The toxins build up and the brain just doesn't function as well. Coma really is a profound or deep state of unconsciousness. You cannot respond to your surroundings. There are times that the affected person will be then placed on life support. Often, for instance, when you have traumatic brain injury, such as in a car accident or a fall, people will be placed on a respirator, a ventilator, so more than to just breathe for them, but to protect them from what we call aspirating, because their swallow is not, their protection of their airway, of their lungs, is not functional. So they will put them on a ventilator, and then often, because they put them on a ventilator, they have to sedate them, because nobody wants that stuck down into their lungs when they have some sort of sensation of it being there. So it can be very confusing. You can have someone who's in a coma, who's not really responsive in a cognitive way in saying, oh, hi, Mom. But they cannot protect their airway. They're on a breathing machine, and you can't really communicate with them. Persistent vegetative state is, the persistent part of that is something that we define after a period of time. And usually it's 3 to 6 months when they really call it persistent. Usually comas only last 2 to 4 weeks, but you get into that persistent vegetative state, and then what you have is you've had a loss of cognitive function. Remember I talked about input, processing, output. Okay, you can actually process the signals that are coming in. You don't have that in the persistent vegetative state. You can have the lower function of the brain stem, which causes you to have a sleep cycle. You go to sleep at night when it's dark, and you wake up when it's light. You can open your eyes, look around. That doesn't necessarily mean that what's going in is being processed. Okay, that there's an awareness. It is felt that there is not an awareness. There is a very rare condition called being locked in, where apparently people who are in short-term states that look like the vegetative state are actually conscious, but they can't communicate. I don't think we know a lot about that, but generally speaking, when in the vegetative state, people don't respond consistently. For instance, Mom comes in and says, hi, and the person looks at them. Do they do that every time? Do they respond consistently? And the answer is no, not in this state. Okay? So it takes a lot of care and precise evaluation to know whether someone's really in this state or whether they're responding. So it can be very challenging. Brain death is an irreversible cessation of all function, the entire brain. Okay, this person can't breathe for themselves. This is like the 16-year-old that came in from a drunk driving episode and had a car accident and had what we call an anoxic injury, had oxygen cut off to the brain. The entire brain died and was on a ventilator, and after she was very thoroughly evaluated, and you have to look very carefully at these people. You have to have several physicians look at them. There are specific criteria that these people have to fit that are very carefully outlined. And what we do is we have in each hospital institution, we have all these criteria spelled out, and if they are not met, that person is not brain dead. And a lot of the brain death definition came about because of organ donation and transplantation. So all this is relatively new. And I'm going to stop here and
Thank you, Dr. Ammons. Next, I think we should turn to our ethicist, Dr. Hansen, to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. I just also want to add my word of welcome and thank you to the rest of you for coming. I think this is a very important conversation for us to have. The Terry Schiavo case, of course, was heartbreaking, and it raised a number of issues that are certainly ethically difficult issues, that are ethically complex, and that I believe there are not easy answers to, that we now have to continue to wrestle with, and have been wrestling with actually for some time. Those ethical values and issues have to do with the value of life and the duty to protect life, the value to take extra precautions to protect those who are in vulnerable situations, but also the value of individual choice and the right to self-determination in regards to medical treatment. Certainly the importance of religious beliefs and the right to a fair process and to fair treatment under the law when such cases have to go to the courts. What I'd like to do in just the few minutes that I have is not to comment unnecessarily per se on the outcome on the Schiavo case, because I think there are probably a number of facts that are unknown to me and unknown to us, and I don't feel myself in a place to comment on or to pass judgment on how that case came out. But I would like, I think for the purpose of the discussion, really to be able to raise for you what I think are the central issues within the field of bioethics and medical ethics, those of us who research and talk about this, that were at play in that case and that will continue to be at play as we move forward with certainly in figuring out the implications of this case. Well, certainly this case was about something that's come to be defined as a fairly fundamental right, both morally and ethically over the last 30 years, and that has to do with the right to refuse medical treatment, the right to make decisions about medical treatment of any kind. One can go back to 1975 in the famous Karen Ann Quinlan case of a woman who was in a persistent vegetative state, who had to go to, her parents had to go to court to have the respirator withdrawn. And the hospital at that time had refused because they would consider a withdrawal of the respirator to her to be, quote, an act of palpable homicide, unquote. We saw some of the same language come up in the Schiavo case. But in essence, what we've seen over the 30 years since the Karen Ann Quinlan case has been, within medical ethics as well as within the law, an increasing affirmation of the patient right to self-determination. And that right to self-determination extends to the right to refuse medical treatments even if one is not terminally ill. One certainly cannot have and ought not to have medical treatment forced upon oneself. And as an example, there was a rather notable case of Elizabeth Bouvier, who had severe cerebral palsy in 1986, who won in Superior Court the right to refuse artificial nutrition and hydration, even though she was not terminally ill, but simply because she did not feel that continued existence was a benefit to her. She was a person, of course, who was competent. She had, she was able to make healthcare decisions for herself, and the court affirmed that. And the question that we're coming to now, of course, is, does that right extend to those times when a person is no longer has the capacity to be able to decide for themselves? A legacy of the Quinlan case were hospital ethics committees, but also the establishment and growth of this idea of the living will, which is a form of advance directive. And living wills are recognized as legal documents that do apply and are binding and recognized both within the field of medicine and within the courts as expressions of patient autonomy. And that's really the principle of medical ethics that has arisen through the last 30 years. And so the question that we have has to do with you know, the extension of those wishes. And I think most Americans value choice. In a poll that was taken 6 days ago, 78% of Americans say that if a patient has been diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state and there is no living will, the ultimate decision for them to be kept alive should lie with the patient's next of kin. We do allow the extension of our autonomy and our wishes to be reflected through those who are designated legally or otherwise as our decision makers. Now, another key issue that was raised by this case has to do with the question, is there something special about artificial nutrition and hydration? The Quinlan case was about a respirator, and when they asked her father, well, what about withdrawing nutrition and hydration? Should we keep that going? And he said, of course, that's what feeds her. We have a sense that somehow nutrition and hydration can be different. I would like to point out that particularly over the last 20 years, as these cases have come before the courts in various varieties, that many within ethics as well as professional organizations, the American Medical Association, the President's Commission on the Study of Behavior and Problems in Medicine in 1982, the American Medical Association Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs in 1982 and 1986, had suggested that, quote, life-prolonging medical treatment includes medical and artificially or technologically supported respiration, nutrition, or hydration. In other words, artificial nutrition and hydration is like medical treatment, and we should make the ethics of our decision-making is not any different for that than it is for respirators, antibiotics, and other forms of treatment. This case brought out a division, I think, in the sense that there are those, and there have been those for quite a long time, who have suggested there's something different about artificial nutrition and hydration. Dan Callahan, who my former boss at the Hastings Center, wrote in the 80s, "The feeding of the hungry is the most fundamental of all human relationships. It is a dangerous business to tamper with, adulterate, so enduring and central a moral emotion, one in which the repugnance against starving people to death could be, on occasion, greater than that which a more straitened rationality would call for." Well, we've seen statements from the Church, from the Pope, and from others who have, in essence, insisted that this is part of basic care. And I think where we're at right now is affirming this right to decide for yourself, affirming the idea that one can, in fact, withdraw treatment without necessarily calling it homicide, but the question of whether or not there may be something special about nutrition and hydration, I think, is one of particular importance in this case, and one that we're going to see further discussion on and action on. So in conclusion, I would just say that certainly advance directives are important. There are variations in state law as to whether or not artificial nutrition and hydration can be refused, and the level of evidence required to recognize what a person's wishes are legally. So these issues will have to be discussed, and my concern is that we have the public policy discussion recognizing a plurality of perspectives, maintaining patient autonomy and providing adequate protection. And I only hope that in our discussions in the political sphere that we don't obscure the important issues and can have a solid discussion on it, and that it not be used strictly or merely for political gain. And so I hope that all of us as citizens will be on guard for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. That's an excellent overview. And we'll be talking more about advanced directives as the night goes on, but I think now we should turn to hospice. I mean, we heard in the news that this woman was cared for at a hospice, and that's all we heard about hospice. It was just at a place. So, Kit, why don't we turn to you, and you can talk to us about these issues, and in particular about hospice. Thank you.
Sure. The hospice philosophy is not that we take away care, and I think a lot of times we get the rap of, you turn to hospice and hospice takes away all of your medications and would starve you to death, and that's not the case at all. What we do is we let people know what the choices are, as well as ensuring that they have an advance directive, that we make sure they have a living will, or that their needs are written down somewhere. And then when the issues come up, we inform people as to, you can have an antibiotic for this, you could not have an antibiotic for this. Either way, we can keep you comfortable. Now, this is your choice as to how you want to to proceed from here. But we don't make those choices for people, and I think that's something that needs to be understood out there. And I wasn't there in Florida, so I as well can't speak to the particulars on that case, but we have been associated before with cases that were somewhat similar to this, and it was end-of-life care, but how can you say what is actually end of life? Even though we say if this disease takes its normal progression, this person most likely would expire within 6 months, we don't know. We don't pretend to be God and say, in 6 months, if you're not gone, well, then you're off of hospice. It doesn't work that way. As long as we think that you probably have a 6-month prognosis, and we would keep you on hospice. And we have had people on hospice for several years, knowing that this disease is not taking its normal prognosis. And so when the issues came to us of the Schiavo case, what we really came to was the wonderful thing that happened was that it really brought an awareness that it's not just old people that need this. What we have so often times when we have our social worker go out and talk to a family member who is dying, and the other family members come, and the person who's dying does their living will, and we've always said, hey, let's get everybody in on this and not just point the finger at the person who's dying. We all need a living will. And so this has really been, in many ways, I think, good for the country, that we have brought this issue up, and it's very much in the forefront. People have issues of it being right for the parents or right for the husband, and we see decisions like this, not with feeding tubes necessarily, but issues like this coming up at end of life a lot. And what we see it coming from is really that basic feeling of love, that the husband loved her and the parents loved her, and to decide what is the greater act of love. And what we challenge people with usually is to say, if there is not a living will, if this person was standing at the end of their bed looking at themselves in that bed, what would they say they wanted? Because it really would be the greater act of love. But we are hoping, with this being so well publicized, that now people of every age will be out there making their needs known and really looking into, what does starvation look like? What does, malnutrition and dehydration look like at the end of life? We have lots of patients who come to us at the end of life and say, but my physician said, my gosh, you've got to get a feeding tube. You can't possibly starve. And we have lots of documented research showing that at the end of life, dehydration and malnutrition are Mother Nature's way. I mean, people don't have cancer and eat 3 meals a day and are fully active. I mean, people start to slow down and they start to eat less, and it is the normal progression. But because we can do things, oftentimes we have the feeling that we should do things, and oftentimes we have felt that technology has really outpaced our ethics. So this gives us a great opportunity to come together and discuss these issues for all of us, because for sure, like death and taxes, for sure, we would want to die well, and we would want to make our needs known. And today's a good day to make it happen.
Thank you, Kit. So as you can see, this is complicated. We have the issues of medicine and science and anatomy, and then we have the issues of ethics. And then we just have the pure mechanics of our humanness and our love for one another. And I also think that there is this issue of spirituality, who we are as spiritual people. And so we'll turn to Greg Shanks, who also works for hospice, but as a hospice chaplain, to talk to us about some of his ideas. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think in part of the hospice philosophy is to relate to the person as a whole person, not to relate to them just as somebody who has a set of symptoms to be dealt with, although hospice is really excellent at management of symptoms, particularly pain control. They're really specialists at that. But the hospice philosophy is to relate to the person as a whole person, and that means not just their physical self, but their psycho-emotional self, their social self, and their spiritual self. And that's really basic to the hospice approach. So that's where my role comes in within hospice. One way to talk about why spiritual care is important in this field is to talk about distinction between pain and suffering. Pain you could talk about as pertaining to a particular aspect of the body, a particular part of the body. You have bone pain, you have liver pain. So pain generally is to do with an aspect of the body. Suffering, you could say, is more to do with a sense of self, a sense of intactness of the person. And that gets challenged at the end of life, a sense of who you are, your identity. Generally, if somebody's been suffering a life-threatening illness, there's been a lot of losses along the way, a lot of small losses that affect your sense of self. So suffering is kind of integral, I guess, at the end of life, or it can be. It can come up as an issue. Anticipatory grief, people grieving their own death before it happens, the people around them, their loved ones, facing into that, facing that loss. So suffering is an element that we're dealing with here. What we try to do in hospice is, in the spiritual dimension, is to validate the person where they're at, is to support them where they're at, not to make judgments about the way that they've lived their life, about the choices that they've made, but to really enter into a dialogue with them and find out what their life has meant for them, how they have made meaning and sense out of their life. And for a lot of people, that's what spirituality is. They're not very able to articulate it and they're very often not interested in metaphysical discussions. They're interested in their family, in how they have lived their life, how that's worked itself out. That, for many people, is how the spirit or soul works itself out in our relationships with others. And one of those issues is letting go, is the issue of loss. And I was wondering about this case. I was thinking a kind of thought experiment. If it hadn't been the parents and this daughter who is dying, if the tables were turned and it was actually about an older parent, I wonder whether there would have been the same kind of emotional charge to the issue. If we were talking about an 85-year-old person, rather than we saw the pictures of this vital person when she was alive before entering into this state, I wonder if we'd have that. Because there's this sense of it's against nature. It's very hard for a parent to lose a child. It's hard for a child to lose a parent. But there's something about our sense of what's expected that when it's that way round, losing a child, there's an extra kind of emotional charge there. So I was thinking, I wonder if the response would have been the same if it was a parent. I wonder if it would have been the same if you hadn't had those images of Terry kind of responding, if she had been in a coma, whether we'd have had the same response. And we've heard that from the doctor that those responses are kind of arbitrary, that with very detailed analysis you could see that they weren't response from a higher kind of level of consciousness. They were just autonomic responses. But would we have responded in the same way? So I guess what I'm just saying there is there's an emotional charge there that says more about our attitudes towards death than says about our actual understanding and knowledge. It's the kind of emotional charge that was in there. And one of those factors is food. We often say in hospice, food is love. Not taking up this Schiavo case where there's artificial food feeding, but as Kit Jackson was saying, in the natural course of events, the body begins to close down, it begins to shut down. And part of that process is you don't want to take in anymore. And people find it really difficult, parents, spouses, whatever, to understand that, to realize there's a natural process going on. It's like food is love, you know. In all families, that's a natural thing. And I remember a case we had recently where the wife had been diabetic all her life, and so the husband had because sometimes she wouldn't be aware of the state she was in, he had to force her to eat at times, otherwise she would have died. And then when she was at the end of life and her liver was irreparably damaged and her whole system was closing down, he found it really difficult to understand that no, this was a different point, that actually she couldn't metabolize that food. And the greater gift, as Kit said, was to realize that you couldn't, feeding wasn't going to help. It's a really difficult case. All you can do is feel for the people involved in this, the level of suffering that we witnessed. And I think it was a terrible shame that it was brought out into the public domain, because all over the country, all over the world, people are having to make these hard choices. Families are making these hard decisions, and to bring it out into the public light and the level of vitriol, the level of just misunderstanding that was brought to bear was sad to see. Lindsay, I can't tell from your note, how much longer have I got? 1 minute? Okay. Quick case. We had a case that had some interesting similarities and dissimilarities. A mother and daughter. The daughter was the one dying. She was being fed by a feeding tube because she had esophageal cancer. She had a trach. She wasn't able to swallow. She wasn't able to breathe in a normal way. She could breathe through the trach. The mother had very strong religious beliefs. She was Pentecostal Christian. She believed the daughter was going to be healed. 100% convinced. I was hoping there would be a miracle, great, but the way the clinical team saw it, the way the doctors saw it, her daughter was dying. This was an example of, it was a really difficult case for hospice. It was an example of what can work. We came in, she was very cautious about letting us in. She said, I don't want you hovering around the bed waiting for my daughter to die. We said, no, that's not what we're about. We'll support you where you're at. We had to support her in that view, her hope, her wish for healing, even though we didn't see it that way. We didn't think that's how it was going to go. Gradually, by the intervention of the whole team, by the care that we could bring to bear, she began to trust us. Her daughter began to trust us. The daughter began to ask us to advocate for her. She had to write. She couldn't speak. She had to write her wishes. Gradually, she began to express differences from her mother. At first, they seemed just completely on the same page about what they wanted. The mother was going to call 911 if we got into a crisis. Gradually, the daughter came to trust us to advocate for us, and she started to say, this is, in effect, this is getting too much. I don't want the feeding in this way. I don't want it going all through the night because it makes me nauseous. I don't want this. The mother found this really hard to handle. So we had to both honor her religious wishes, the way she was seeing it, honor her wishes about what she thought was best for her daughter, begin to honor her daughter's wishes as she expressed about what she wanted. In the end, after our involvement with this family for a while, she did die, the daughter died. And what happened was the mother was able to come to some peace with that. She was able to find peace with that. And that was because of it was a happier ending than we saw the Schiavo case. It was because all the intervention, all the support from the hospice team had been able to honor all the differences, the different points of view that were there, and bring it to the only conclusion it was going to come, that she was going to die. But to do it, to leave the parties there not in a space of well, how things had been left with the Schiavo case. Obviously they were grieving, but there was some sense of peace at the end.
Thank you, Greg. Now we're going to move on to another issue, and I want to distinguish between politics and policy, because we're going to talk about politics with Pat Williams. And certainly it would be nice to think that what happened in Florida happened in Florida and all the politics, that's never going to happen again. But in our state legislature, which is winding down this week, there were 4 bills that I know of that dealt with end-of-life issues. 3 of them passed and 1 of them didn't. And I wonder how many people in this room know about any of them. None of us, well, except for some of us. So, you know, policy decisions are being made that affect all of us at all levels of government, and then there's the political aspect that gets put over the top of that by our politicians who are making policies. So I want to turn it to you, Pat, to give us your observations about what you saw and what we can learn from this event.
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me in the public policy arena, which after all is everywhere and engages each of us. End-of-life issues are very difficult, perhaps because they're so it is so multifaceted, involving spiritual, scientific, legal, ethical, and moral, which often denotes religions and the teachings of religious organizations. And as we have recently witnessed, end-of-life issues can be basely and grossly political, usually done under cover of religion. Tonight I want to address the religion and politics facet of this difficult matter. In my personal judgment, religion and politics, like oil and water, simply don't mix. No matter how or when or where in American history we've tried to stir them, shake them, force them together, religion and government have, in the end, denied each other as a twin, be it in our county commissions, state legislatures, the United States Congress, or our classrooms. In the American system, government and religion are exclusive to each other. Do you remember the Eastern Montana school teacher in Ivan Doig's book, Rascal Fair? His name was Angus, and I think it was a school board member named Ninian who came to him with a complaint. One of the parents wanted him to teach a little more morality. He was being challenged. Let me give you the conversation. It went like this. First, Angus. Ninian, I can't get into that. You can say all day long you want a bit of orthodoxy, or this family wants a bit of orthodoxy. But there's your orthodox, there's your doxy, and there's my doxy, and there's everyone's doxy. There's always somebody's doxy. What's that parent want? Is he saying that I don't trot Martin Luther into the classroom often enough? And then there are the Roziers down the road. I can invite the Pope to visit, and that'll satisfy them. Angus, understand me now, said Ninian. I'm troubled by this myself. You know, this matter was simpler when we were both still over there in Scotland. Angus. Oh, was it? Then you don't hold with that fellow who said the history of Scotland is the entire history of one long riot of the righteous against the righteous. Now, Angus, don't start. Ninian, you and the others can fill your children with funnels of religion at home. But I won't do it for you here at school. If you want a church school, Ninian, you and the others ought to fire me and go hire a preacher. Americans won't let it mix. 45 years ago in Houston, Texas, a presidential candidate, Senator John Kennedy, addressed the Greater Houston Ministerial Association and, among other things, said this: "I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general population or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is an act against every church in this country. I would not look with favor upon a president working to subvert the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty, nor would our system of checks or balances permit him to do so. And neither do I look with favor upon those who would work to subvert Article 6 of the Constitution by requiring a religious test. For if they disagree with that constitutional safeguard, they should simply openly work to repeal it. Now, lately, just a few weeks ago, Americans were treated for the first time in a long time with the outright attempt to teach from the Oval Office our morals and our religions, and to require from the Congress of the United States the overturning of laws to force judges to do what some, tragically, most members of the House and Senate wanted those judges to do in the name of their morality, given to them, understandably, in most cases, by their religious organizations. When Jack Kennedy ended his inaugural address, he said, "Remember, so we should go forth now, remembering that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own." But as near as I can tell, from watching closely and remembering the work of Jack Kennedy and most other presidents, and comparing them with the work on the Schiavo matter of this president, there is a big difference. Jack Kennedy believed he was talking to God. This president believes God is talking to him. There's a hell of a big difference in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Well, do we have a congressman still with us, or what? Before I turn the conversations to our last panelist, I want to remind you that we have, I believe, yellow sheets that have been distributed to you for your questions of the panelists. You can direct your questions specifically to one of them or to all of them. Feel free to fill those out, and someone will be walking down the middle of the room to pick them up during this next presentation. Thank you, Barbara. Or throughout our question and answer part.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara Spring was co-founder of LifeSend Institute, and we are the nation's oldest and probably most well-known end-of-life organization that is community-based, that does these kinds of things in the community, gets people to talk about end-of-life issues and really reckon with some of this stuff. So I want to hear from Barbara about how our work at LifeSend Institute and in this community can respond to these issues.
Mm-hmm. I really was going to talk about being a gerontologist, but that's okay. I'll do that too. I'm really glad that we had this Schiavo case, actually, because as hard as it was for us as a nation and as many issues as it did bring up, I think it is extremely important that we have the conversation. And that's why we have the Choices Bank back here, because we want you to pick up your documents and we want you to fill them out. We have had more advanced directives coming into the Choices Bank in this last month, and you know, it's a nice flow. People in and out of the office and at other places to pick up, and we're delighted with that. It's important to have those conversations and get them documented and start that. So we're very thankful for that. And also, you know, we got the Choices Bank bill, or the Advanced Directive Repository bill, through the state legislature this last week or Saturday. And, you know, we should call it probably the Schiavo bill, because I'm not sure it would have gotten through the state legislature without the energy of the Schiavo case. So we're real thankful in some ways to have the energy brought forward for us to remind us of the challenges. But as a gerontologist, I am particularly concerned to remind us that the chronic illness in old age is ever more of a problem than the young person that dies prematurely. We have so many people that are lasting so long into old age, and the challenge of knowing how to die is really a very important factor that I think we have to really come to grips with and try to understand and what to do with. And my best illustration is to tell you about my mother. Certainly, she came from 8 years of taking care of my father, who was an Alzheimer's victim, and had some very difficult medical experiences dealing with an Alzheimer's person. And the last one is the most traumatic. I mean, she knew he was dead, but she didn't have anybody around to verify it, so she called 911, and you know what they do when they call 911, so they came and pounded on him and took him to the hospital, and you know, and that was the last she saw of him. So, you know, it's just not the way to die, even after all those years of caregiving. But the things that are most important, I think, for when we're getting into old age factors, is knowing how we can die comfortably. So my mother came to live with me. She was very frail, but we lived as fully as we could possibly do it. And we indeed treated pneumonia, and we went to the hospital when she got a GI bleed and pumped her full of new blood, and you know, and struggling along, and so we'd have these conversations. What do you want to do, Mom? You know, where are you at and all this? And she said, I want to go to heaven and be with Jesus. You know, and she'd say that over and over. I want to go to heaven and be with Jesus. And then we'd, you know, go to the park and do what we need to do, and you know, but that was her message. So how are we going to do it? You know, what's the recourse in doing that? So we talk about is next time you get pneumonia, do you want to have the penicillin to kill the pneumonia? You know, pneumonia is the old man's friend. Just we'll think about that, and we talk to my brothers about that, and so we get the conversations going all across the family. And then when you get, you know, the next GI bleed, you want to go to the hospital, or what's the reaction? And so the next GI bleed she got, she said, we'll just rest with it. Well, she did heal up from that. She didn't go to the hospital. But we had the conversation so we could take a breath and decide. As it turned out, she died 5 days after her last grandchild's wedding in a very peaceful death. And I can't help but think that having, you know, given her some options and having thought through it, she was comfortable allowing her own death and working through to what she wanted to do to the fullness of her life. And that was a real pleasant thing. But the natural death, allowing the natural death, I think, for me as a gerontologist, is one of the important things. And until we get to that point, being conscious of what chronic illnesses come to bear on each elderly person and how we deal with each of those. Is it a GI bleed? Is it the chronic pneumonia? What are the factors that are coming to bear on that person, and how do we deal with it comfortably, or to make sure that it treats the choices that people want to make? And certainly living life to the fullest with the best kind of care is the responsibility we have as a community and as a society. So that's, I think, that's my little thing of pieces. And we haven't talked too much. Maybe Lily's going to talk more about this, but we have lots of copies of this Hard Choices for Loving People. And this is the kind of thing that'll give you direction on the specific kinds of things that might come up for your loved one, or for you.
Thank you, Barbara. We have lots of questions from all of you, and I'm going to just ask this question of the group, and figure that there will be some of you who will want to respond to it. This is a great question. It's very simple. How does a family know what is the right thing to do?
I want to speak to that.
Okay.
This is my question.
Okay.
I'm kind of a relic. At 1935, I was stricken with polio, and it destroyed my family. Dad went on the road. My sister and I didn't talk to each other for maybe 4 years or so. Mother went into the bottle. And when the Schiavo case came up, I was really empathizing with that terrifically polarized family. Just, and I thought of my family. And I thought of the fact that I went into the lung, survived that. Many operations under ether, spinal taps without anesthesia, physiotherapy. The whole thing took about 5 years, I guess. But the worst part, in the psychological sense, because the physical part I still wear prosthetics, just cope through that. But the psychological part took maybe 30 years to get over. And the reason for that was that I was in a ward for probably a year. I can remember every detail of that ward, and I was the only kid in that ward who rolled out alive. Every other child went out under a sheet. And I think nobody's ever been able to explain to me how it was that I got through all this, but I have a hunch. And my hunch is that Mom came down to Children's Hospital in Boston, belted down maybe 2 shots of bourbon, walked in and raised hell about 4 times a week. I think I got better care. Did not want Harrington out in their lives. And she died of cancer in 1971 in my arms, as a matter of fact. So that's my question. How in the world does a family, especially a family that is divided by religion and where the religion lines up with, Christ, how do you know what to do? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, who's going to take that one?
Well, I mean, as you point out, there are no easy answers. I mean, when we have the privilege of being invited into somebody's home and into their family, all the disciplines make an assessment, and I kind of wish we had a social worker here to speak to that, because that obviously that psychosocial dimension is really key in that situation. How is the family going to cope? What is going on within the family? And so pass it to the social worker to deal with. But no, there aren't any easy answers. And we say, we have these little catchphrases that in hospice, and one of them is that you meet people where they're at, or that you can't fix. You come into a family system that's been established for 20, 30 years, and it's not our role to fix that. We can't make it all right. We can be one influence on that situation. We can have a dialogue. We can give good information. And then I want to say it's a crapshoot. I mean, sometimes families do come together and they do resolve differences, and there is forgiveness and there is harmony at the end, and sometimes they don't. And that's all I can say to that.
Thanks.
I would say, from a physician's perspective, that you really need to know your resources in your community, whether it is the church's hospice, a specialist, other things, and I think very much so you have to meet the people where they're at. And also you have to be supportive of those people no matter where they are at in a real true sense, because I've seen so many people second guess themselves, try and project, where this might go, what if, and you really have to just do your best at the moment and give yourself a break.
I think we'll move on to the next question. We've got lots of them. We'll see how many we can get through.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for those answers. Here's another one that's kind of getting down to the how-to of all of this. It says, the advance directive from the Choices Bank says that if in the opinion of the attending physician, the person is terminal, which comes out of our Montana Rights of the Terminally Ill Act, that language. Yet, tonight we heard that it takes many doctors and a long list of criteria. I've submitted my advance directives, but I'd rather have several qualified specialists weigh my case before they follow my directions and pull the tubes. Please comment on what would really happen if I came to the hospital in a terminal condition, perhaps from an auto accident.
I would love to discuss that, because it gets me get into something I didn't get a chance to talk about. When people come into the hospital, they have to be fully assessed. And part of that also, and number one is you may have to name them John or Jane Doe, because they may not have identification, but the first thing you do is you find out who they are and who their next of kin is. And you absolutely have to identify somebody related to them as soon as you can. And until you can do that, you absolutely support their physical condition and continue to assess it at length. Just because you have a living will doesn't mean, we're going to pull the plug. I guarantee you. For instance, in the brain death definition, there are 9 criteria. And, we have to look at whether or not somebody's on a drug or has some metabolic disorder that might interfere with their ability to respond. And believe me, drugs is one of my first things to look at whenever someone's having a problem. Are they on any medications? Because that's very common, okay? So we're very, very systematic about it. And we look for reversible causes of whatever their condition is, and we do very careful neurologic assessment, and frankly, we're getting to the point where we're actually trying to decide whether they are brain dead or persistent vegetative state, or something irreversible. There are specialists involved. And if you have somebody that you can't assess and say, okay, the only movement they have is due to some basic reflex from their spinal cord, they have no cough, they can't protect their airway at all, you poke them in the eye and they don't blink. That's a reflex that should be intact if your brain is functioning. There are a number of things that you absolutely have to look at. You can do studies, you have to do studies, including what we call an electroencephalogram, where they put all the little guys all over your head and they look at the brain waves. And if they are not normal, you know a lot more about what's going on. You do scans. And there are various scans you can do. You can do the simple CTs, and I happen to know that some slice of a CT of the recent case of Terry's brain was all over the internet, and I really felt badly about that because it was just this, it's kind of like it's pulling out some random bit of information that has no context, because you really have to look at the entire case, and that was, I think, a real disservice to a lot of people. So you're looking at their entire metabolic situation. You're looking at specific studies, and one of the last things you can look at in terms of a study is actually looking at blood flow to the brain. Because if you have an injury to the brain where the brain cells die, blood flow is not going to happen. So that's another thing. So what we have is I have a whole long list here, 9 things, but they say 9, but it really comes out to about 12. And they come down to a very complex thing of items 2 through 7 have to be yes. In other words, they have to be positive findings. And 2 people have to decide this, and they have to do examinations 2 to 6 hours apart. And it's very involved, okay? So the person who's worried about someone pulling the plug, it ain't going to happen.
So in other words, the hospital's protocol trumps the choices being directed in that particular case.
Well, you do this in sequence, okay? You do this in sequence. And frankly, I always said to my partners in medicine, you know, I said, you know, hey, if I come in and that, you know, that CT is, you know, nasty and there's no EEGs nasty, I said, you pull the plug or I'll come back and haunt you, you know. So, but they have to go through that process. They're not going to look at me and just do that. They're not going to say, oh, living will. It's on the chart. So, for instance, I went into a cardiac arrest. My heart stopped, okay, and they tried to resuscitate me, and sometimes you can't. They would know to stop after a certain period of time. That would make a difference, okay? But it's really, truly a sequence of decisions. Yes?
When I filled out my choices bank, I gave very specifics like that. I mean, you can be as specific as you want to be. I mean, instead of just saying, well, if it doesn't look like I'm going to survive, just pull the plug. You can say, I want several physicians. You can pick the physicians you want to make that determination. That's a nice thing about the bank. You can spell it out, and it doesn't have to just fit those lines.
You know, the point, the only real point I wanted to be able to make tonight was on this. I don't even know who ought to make the decision for me. What I'm convinced about is that you should not want John Kerry or George Bush or Tip O'Neill or Pat Williams or Dick Gebhardt or Conrad Burns or Max, who know nothing about your situation, making the decision for you. And that's what we faced a few days ago.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, you know, no one can know, none of us know what our situation will be or when. And that's the point of learning about what might happen in the ER, which is different than what would happen if you're up in med-surg and suffering from a chronic illness and came in with pneumonia. And, you know, so there's all these different situations, and none of them are predictable. We don't get to know. And so conversations like this, I think, are very helpful to learn the nuances of what really goes on. Now, there are a couple questions that came across that are all about one thing, and that is something that we haven't talked about tonight. People want to know, what about the money? How do the financial considerations come into this kind of decision-making, or do they?
You know, I see this all the time, or have, in many circumstances, not just end of life. I had an elderly woman that clearly had severe rheumatoid arthritis, was in great pain, had deformities. She literally waited until she was 65 before she would start any kind of medication to specifically treat it. And it was financial, completely financial, and it drove me crazy. But this happens, and it happens all the time. I think, you know, there's an unfortunate reality to the finances of medical care in many cases, but fortunately in the United States, we have options. And again, that's where you look for your resources, okay? And you have to be really good at knowing which social worker to call, and what your options are, and those kinds of things. And there are ways, if you really need to find a way to get the treatment, you can. But again, sometimes it comes down to choices about where your money's going to go. And I've seen some people do some pretty strange things when they had plenty of money, making choices not to do certain things. So again, it's going to come down to individual choice a lot of the time, regardless.
I should think that if you're worried that your family is going to be destitute, that's as much of a right to make your decision based on that as it is for physical reasons. I think, I don't know, I would address that to the ethicist. I mean, does the reason matter why you choose to make your own decisions?
Well,
That's the point.
I didn't hear the other point. Well, does the reason matter? I mean, I think the first point that I would want to make is that the first point of priority, as Pat has helped us recognize, is who gets to choose which reasons matter. People are going to have, particularly when you get into these murkier ethical areas such as persistent vegetative states and artificial nutrition and hydration, people are going to have different sensibilities about what is that medical care, is that a basic human ethical obligation, and so on. And I think the important thing that we want to safeguard in the upcoming discussion is the fact that when it comes to very significant obligations about which people of goodwill disagree, that the choice should remain, with the individual. And so that means through a competent patient making decisions for him or herself, or through designated durable power of attorney or next of kin, and so on, or through a living will. Now, do the reasons matter? I mean, I think when you have people can decide that they don't want to have their life sustained for all sorts of reasons, and some of those may have to do with that they don't want to be a financial burden to their family. Some of that may be they don't want to be a financial burden to society. They don't want to use medical resources or spend money that could otherwise go to other care. It may be that a persistent vegetative state is something that they don't consider to have dignity, or that they value their independence. And there are other people who are going to value mere biological life and the possibilities of miracles and so on. I mean, there are, as Pat pointed out, a lot of different doxies out there. Now, I mean, and I guess my point is that if you want to have, you can pass judgment on other people's choices. Sure, you can say, well, she doesn't want to be maintained that way because she doesn't look good in a hospital gown and whatever, or aesthetic reasons. But I think the point is that it's up to the person and their self-exploration for defining their values. And I think what I hope, along with Pat, is that we don't have a situation of suggesting that certain values are better than others.
Are there others that want to respond to that? Because I have another question that dovetails right in. We're talking about individual choices, but then there's a healthcare proxy or a designated power of attorney for healthcare who may come into play. And there's a couple questions about that, and I wondered if we could start first with an explanation of the real thing of decision making. Who's involved, and when does the healthcare proxy come in, and when is it the patient who's really calling the shots? And maybe, Kit, you could start with that, and then the others can jump in.
I think the misnomer out there is that people think once they've made an advance directive, then if they go kicking and screaming into the ER, that no matter what they say, that their advance directive is going to come into play, and that's just not the case. As long as you're still speaking for yourself, it doesn't matter what you wrote down. You're the decision maker until you can't say. So we just try to clear that up for people. As long as you can say, you can change at any moment. What kind of care you want. And we tell that to our patients as well. You know, we don't say, well, now you can't call 911 because you have a living will, you know, you've made the choice that you don't want 911. If your heart stops and you know, or you're having palpitations and you panic and you call 911, so be it. You know, you always have the choice. So I'll pass it along now.
And then the proxy, I'll speak to the proxy, because I have a situation where I think it's rather interesting. I chose my durable power of attorney for healthcare, my proxy, as a friend who has common values, and we actually are proxies for each other. And as things come along, then we think, now see, that's what I think, and yeah. And I have a daughter who's an MD. Whew, I would never have her for my durable power of attorney. Are you kidding? I mean, she plugged me into everything, and who knows what else would happen. I mean, you know, because probably, you know, she probably, you know, doesn't want me to leave as much as my friend does. So, yeah. So I think choosing someone who you know can get beyond the emotional boundaries and can be there for you, and you have a common value system. And a backup for that person too is helpful.
I guess I would just also add on the issue of proxies. I mean, advanced directives, you know, don't fix everything. I mean, there are many difficulties with them. The fact that, you know, practical difficulties that they may have been done a long time ago, or they may be too vague. There always is this issue of interpretation. Does it apply to this case? You know, when a person said they don't want heroic measures, well, is this a heroic measure? So there are certain, I think, both practical as well as philosophical issues, but obviously trying to be as clear as you can. And also, as far as the proxy goes, it's a proxy, or what we're referring to is that surrogate decision maker, is ethically obligated, first of all, to act based on what you would have wanted. So, I mean, they shouldn't say, well, just because I'm designated now, I'm going to say that I don't want, you know, treatment, when it seems like the living will portion of the directive says that they would like it. So one does have an obligation to try, again, to represent the patient, what's called substituted judgment in those situations. And secondly, when one does have to interpret or the wishes aren't known, one has to do one's best to act in what would be the best interests of the patient. So there are some ethical boundaries on, I think, properly on proxies as well, in terms of what their responsibilities are. And I think, you know, Barbara's point is a good one, in that you would want to really select somebody who is going to be able to interpret most consistently with how you would likely have interpreted those kinds of things.
Is a proxy legal?
Is it legal?
Proxy?
Is that illegal?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we call it durable power of attorney for healthcare in the state of Montana. Some states have different top names, but it is a legal designation.
And I know from my professional stance, it is just critical for me to ask the questions that need to be asked. And so for each patient, I need to have those discussions. If they are ill and their family's involved, their family needs to be educated about what the options are and brought into the entire process. And I feel very strongly that's you need to always also be able to look them in the eye and say, I hear your opinion, I hear where you're coming from. This is about you or about the patient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You said that the durable power of attorney is the legal process in Montana. Does that supersede next of kin? If you assign a friend durable power attorney, if the next of kin steps forward and says, look, you know, she hasn't seen her for 20 years, this is where we stand. And I mean, that to me looks like a Schiavo case all over again.
No, Well, I certainly, it's my obligation in choosing that person to also inform my daughter and my son and make sure that all the family is in agreement there, and or else, yeah,
But it
I
is-
will get in trouble.
But they do have legal priority.
They do have
if it's a
legal
legally
priority.
valid document.
Mhm.
And I know that there are also, I'm not sure the law in the state of Montana, but if there is no one designated, I know some states at least designate a priority
We have-
list.
we
And I
have-
think Montana has that as well.
Surrogacy law, Montana surrogacy law.
Right.
Your spouse, your adult children, your parents. It's designated in our state code, actually.
Of course, it would also be important to make sure that you keep that updated, so that you're, as you said, you know, I haven't seen that person in 20 years, well, but, you know,
When I look
it's
at the last
incumbent.
time, updated my will. That's 20 years ago.
Well, and it
And the
is
same
different
thing.
than
This is-
a will.
Yeah.
For your durable power of attorney for healthcare is the same as your power of attorney.
For our last question, I want to try to combine some of these that kind of get after the Schiavo case in the sense of why. How did this happen? How did we become a nation that was obsessed with one person whom we'd never met before? And what is the normal, or is there a normal course of events for most people who we never hear about? And how can we as citizens make sure that our own dying or those of our loved ones doesn't become a political circus, a media happening, but that we can learn from this experience and move on from it?
It's difficult to know how news becomes news. It's, have you read Tipping Point? Well, there's a tipping point in the news, and it suddenly, somebody suddenly picks it up. Some network or reporter or blog sometimes just picks it up. And the news is such today, it's so commercialized, it's so critical to viewership and readership that no organization dare be left behind if the story appears to be one in which people are interested. And so they pick it up. I don't mean to say that it's all just based on commercialism, because this story had a certain interest, public interest, families struggling and what is life and what isn't life. But why this woman and this family, I don't think we know. It really has more to do with this almost accidental collision of tipping point forces. The Congress got into it. I'd call 4 of my friends back there that were close to this. The Congress got into it because they polled it. And it said, here's how you hold the far right. You hold the far right by getting in this case. The majority of the Congress has to hold the far right to get elected and re-elected, so they get in it. It was driven by polls. And how would you like your life decided by George Gallup?
Well, I think that the reason it became such a hot issue is because everybody could identify. You know, as a parent you identified, as a child you identified, as a spouse you identified, and it was a life or death issue. I mean, of course, you know, everybody stood up and took notice of that.
Yeah, I was asked the same thing by the class that I teach here in medical ethics, and my initial response was, well, you know, this has all the classic elements that make for the great TV miniseries, right? I mean, you've got family conflict, you've got, you know, life and death situations, you've got, you know, the drama and the suspense that this is going down to the last minute. What, you know, is there going to be an appeal? Is the judge going to make the decision? And if it doesn't, now we have a race against the clock. And I mean, in some ways, it's a sort of, you know, there are some components of it which just, you know, are the kind of drama that people seem to be drawn toward. It also fit in, I think, in the political aspect of this, highlighted this, that, you know, it fits into a tension of some important values within the United States, a sort of warring of, you know, I mean, what sort of becomes loosely defined as a culture wars, this was another issue set within that kind of framework that had to do with some issues about freedom of choice and process for deciding, and within the courts, and this is the way we should do things, and politicians shouldn't be deciding for us, and fundamental questions about right to life, and which certainly there are political constituents now which are wrestling in light of the last election with, how do we, how do they accommodate and respond to this faction within our society. But I also think, just a final comment is, we can all relate to it, and the sense in which imagining ourselves in such a situation, being confronted with our own mortality, and recognizing that there's something really basic and almost instinctual at stake here. And that really had to do with the fact, how do we, do we need to provide at least, food and water? Are we really starving somebody? And maybe as somebody who studies and thinks about ethics, I just was caught by that more than anything. But it sort of generated, I think, certainly a conflict within my own mind, but very, very instinctual basic values that we have about how we respond to each other. We're really challenged here.
Did you have anything to add?
No, I think what two people on the other side of me said has covered what I would say. I think it's just a very difficult question. What would really serve in that situation? Is it to let go, or is it to extend life? I mean, these are not. I mean, I have my view. We all have our view, but they really are, as we say, had the elements that would. The elements that could become a media circus and were used in that way, but at the core, I guess, there were these kind of really essential issues that we could identify with and empathize with, and that's part of why it could. No easy answers.
I would like to first say I totally agree that everybody could identify with this. There's no question about it, and I personally identified with it at a lot of different levels. And I was on the internet a fair amount looking at stuff, and the things that really struck me were, one of them was people's fear of dying. Huge fear of death. And, because of my profession, I've been very much exposed to it in many different venues. And frankly, and this is my opinion, there are worse things than dying.
But I think this case, and for the same reason an advanced directive for young people is hard, is it takes away a hope that Christopher Reeve gave us that pretty soon we're going to have a miracle for brain injury and spinal trauma, and you're taking away that hope of someone who's in a car accident thinking, hey, keep her alive for 10 more years. Look, we just solved the human genome. This is just that's what's being left behind when you're dealing with young people. As Brent brought up earlier, the difference between an old timer, they're not going to be here 30 years from now if they're an educated state at age 92 to see what the miracle cure is for brain injury, but a 30-year-old might. And that's what you're taking away, is that miracle, if you want it to be, or technology getting to the level that exponentially it's trying to. And then it comes back again to the financial question. What's our obligation to society? How young a baby are you going to keep alive? How long are you going to keep this term? And to what steps are you going? It's all mismatched. And that hope for young people is, I think, the difference between who do you keep alive and how long.
But you've got to ask, what is hope? I mean, none of us are immortal, None of us are getting out of this alive, so, So what is your hope for immortality? So at some point there has to be, but I take your point.
See, I think essentially the way to keep young people's hopes alive is not to vote, is not to have government voting on whether or not to plug or unplug, but to having them having government vote to properly fund the kind of research that we need. The very people that wanted to vote this way on Terry Schiavo vote against National Institute of Health funding. That's what young people need.
Right.
That's the hope they need.
Yeah.
Put that in
That's
the-
what old people need too.
Yeah.
Ageism.
Well, I want to thank our panelists and thank our co-sponsors, the Institute for Medicine and Humanities and the Center for Ethics at the University of Montana. And I certainly want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Before I close, I have one announcement. For those of you who want to continue discussing these kinds of things, on Wednesday, between 11:30 a.m. and 2 p.m. is the Hospice Foundation of America annual teleconference, and it's going to be sponsored out at Community Medical Center. And the title of this year's teleconference is Living with Grief, Ethical Dilemmas at the End of Life. And this is a free offering, and certainly anyone here is welcome to attend. Now, there was one question that asked what are the bills that came before the Montana legislature, and it dovetails right into what I want to close with, so I'll tell you. There was a bill by Senator Trudy Schmidt, Senate Bill 1, interestingly. You heard there were thousands of bills. The first bill that was proposed in the Senate was to allow us to designate on our driver's license whether or not we have a living will, and that bill passed. House Bill 526 was a bill that would have really changed the language of the Montana Rights of the Terminally Ill Act. That act came in response to the Karen Ann Quinlan case, and it really is the legal basis for refusing medical treatment. And the sponsors of that bill wanted to say that people could say that they wanted medical treatment, and they wanted to codify that and say that instead of our living wills primarily saying, you know, we want things stopped, there would be language to say that we could also in our living wills say we want things to continue indefinitely, and that bill did not pass. There are similar bills of that nature all over the United States that have obviously come up from people who have different opinions. House Bill 726, which passed on Saturday, will create a statewide registry, internet registry for advanced directives, your living wills and your power of attorney for health care. And that bill was sponsored by Representative Rosie Buzzis with lots of help from Carol Williams in the Senate. And it will very likely model the Choices Bank system that we developed here in Missoula, only the internet gateway will be through the Attorney General's website. And finally, to remind you that end-of-life issues are much broader, certainly, than decision-making. I'll tell you about the last bill that passed, and I don't know it was a Senate joint resolution, I don't know the number, but it was to create a state commission on painting.
28.
Senate Joint Resolution 28. And this commission will largely be spearheaded by our organization and the Montana chapter of the American Cancer Society, as well as a lot of other organizations who in the next 2 years will be looking at pain management issues in our state. So I wanted to close by reading you something that I hope will point you to the back of the room, to the Choices Bank, and to some of the resources that we have back there. We named this event tonight, Hard Choices for Loving People, after a book written by Hank Dunn, who is also a hospital chaplain. And Hank says, and this is probably something that you all know, but I'll read it. The generations alive today are the first generations faced with making such difficult choices about potentially life-prolonging medical decisions. Really. Nobody else before us had to do this. And this booklet says there's 4 main questions that we should talk about with one another, with our loved ones, and with our healthcare providers. Shall resuscitation be attempted? Shall artificial nutrition and hydration be utilized? Should a nursing home resident or someone ill at home be hospitalized? And the 4th question is it time to shift the treatment goal from cure to hospice or comfort care only? Those questions are addressed in detail in this little booklet, which we have for sale in the back of the room, Hard Choices for Loving People. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you so much, all of you, for coming tonight.